Okay, so this video is a response to John Lennox and a lecture he gave at the Ravi Zachariah Institute. I know that probably tells you all you need to know, entitled Should We Fear Artificial Intelligence? Now, John Lennox is no stranger to this particular video series, as many of you may well be aware. But rather than dealing with his general Christian apologetics, I'm dealing with this particular lecture, which was brought to my attention by one of my biggest patrons who's sponsored my material to quite a high degree for a few years now, and I'm very grateful for that support. And I'm very grateful for them for bringing this lecture to my attention, because it chimes into two areas that I'm interested in. Artificial general intelligence and the dangers that could pose to us, but also Christian apologetics, which John Lennox draws together in this little talk. So what I want to do, there's about 2 hours of footage in this particular talk. I think I'm going to have to play you about 12 minutes of it, looking at the clips that I've got lined up. So I'm going to intersperse my thoughts with that. Let me start by saying that the talk started with the guy who was introducing and hosting the event waxing lyrical about what an amazing person John Lennox is, both in his scientific capacity, then as a Christian. Then they sat down and discussed how wonderful it is to be a Christian and what a wonderful person God is, etc., etc., and how John Lennox had come to be a Christian, and all the atheists he's known over the years that have suddenly found God, blah, blah, blah. All that kind of usual fare. Then he got on with his talk. And it started out as a fairly bog standard talk on artificial intelligence, and not a bad talk, quite well worth a watch. He started off talking about narrow artificial intelligence and the different spheres in our society where it is incorporated. No God brought in at this point. He was just simply dealing with the facts of how these things integrate into our society. He then got into a little bit of a pickle with himself when he started talking about artificial general intelligence, which surprised me given what an intelligent man John Lennox is that he seemed to conflate artificial general intelligence, super intelligence and transhumanism in about 10 seconds, saying that artificial general intelligence is sometimes known as transhumanism, and what it all means is creating artificial intelligences that are superior in their intelligence to human beings. Of course, these are all slightly different things. Artificial general intelligence involves creating artificial intelligences that cover the same array of domains of intelligence as human beings do, of at least to a kind of similar capacity or to a greater capacity. Superintelligence is artificial general intelligences that are to a capacity that far exceed our capacity. And of course, transhumanism involves human beings, and either biologically or through hardware interfaces or otherwise souping up our own intelligence to levels greater than they are at present. So these are all different things that he was talking about there. Nevertheless, I thought it started out quite strongly, and there was some quite good analysis and conjecture of the situation as is now and how it could develop before suddenly it seemed to go off the rails. And it's something that I've seen before. I've seen people like John Lennox segue from talking about things which are part of the scientific consensus or broad scientific discussion into the theological realm, but rarely have I seen it done so brazenly without missing a beat, as if he's talking about things which are just as much a part of the scientific consensus. He may as well have stood there and said, but you know, we already know that magic exists because of course we know about the case of Gandalf. Right? That is as unblinking as the things that he actually says, as if he's just carrying on with his sort of scientific analysis of the state of artificial intelligence. Let me play you a clip so you can see exactly what I mean.
Now, against that background, I want to think very briefly with you of the alternative worldview, the biblical perspective. And the Bible announces that we do not have to wait for superintelligence because it already exists. God, the Word, the one who created our universe by speaking it into being, so that mind and God and word are primary and the physical universe is derivative. That's exactly opposite to the assumption that the physical universe is primary and everything else is derivative. And the intriguing thing about the Genesis account of creation is the 2 days on which God spoke more than once, the third and the sixth. And on the third day, the distinction was between inorganic material and life. You do not get in Scripture a transition from inorganic to organic without the words "and God said." Now, what's that telling us? In modern terminology, it's telling us that the world we regard as the natural world is not a closed system of cause and effect. It was built stepwise by God speaking energy and information from outside an open system and building it up. The second occasion on which God spoke more than once is to differentiate between animals and human beings. You don't get from animals to human beings without "and God said."
And on top of this sudden switch to theological facts from scientific facts, the other thing that jumps out to me here is that he appears to be suggesting that it needs just a little bit of God's magic. All these things, you want to create something human-like, you're going to need a little bit of God's magical power, a little bit of his magical powder in there and a wave of his little magical wand if you want to be able to make these things happen, implying that perhaps the kind of steps that we would need to create an artificial general intelligence are not possible. That was the kind of vibe that I got off there, and he repeated that vibe later on. But what you will note in this talk is that it's very reminiscent, since we're talking of the Bible, of the kind of documentary hypothesis theory of the Old Testament, in fact the books of the Torah, and the idea that there was these different sources, a couple of Israel from the tribes of Israel, a couple from the tribes of Judea. Of course, it's the it's the Yahwist, Elohist, priestly and Deuteronomical sources, and then this redactor draws them all together. So we get these stories, don't we? Like the story of the Great Flood and Noah, where there are effectively two narratives woven together and they contradict one another. It's two of each animal, well no, it's two of some animals and 7 of other animals, and it's 40 days and 40 nights, or is it 120 days and nights? We can't be sure. And the theory is it's because these are two separate stories, two separate oral traditions. Nobody wants to piss on anybody's chips. The redactor doesn't want to piss anybody off, so he just incorporates both versions in and says, well, you can just sort it out for yourself. Both your stories are in there somewhere if you dig deep enough. And very much John Lennox's speech was along those lines, because while there are these chunks which very much hints at the fact that he doesn't think it's possible that we can create these things, there's other sections of the video where not only does he think it is possible, but the Bible actually predicts that these things are going to happen. I'll come to that in due course. But what is important, what is central to his whole analysis is something that was said by Yuval Noah Harari, who is a professor of history at the University of Jerusalem, when he used the word Homo Deus, that's man as God, to describe what we could become in terms of the advancements that we could make to our own intelligence. Let me play you John Lennox talking about that.
The first one I want to bring to your attention is Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari, an Israeli historian. It's called A Brief History of Tomorrow. It would be necessary, he writes, to change our biochemistry and re-engineer our bodies and minds, so that we shall need to re-engineer Homo sapiens, so that it can enjoy everlasting pleasure. Having raised humanity above the beastly level of survival struggles, we will now aim to upgrade humans into gods and turn Homo sapiens into Homo Deus.
So clearly, to anybody with more intelligence than a limpet, right, it's pretty obvious that Harari is using this as metaphor, and I'm certain that John Lennox is aware of that, and yet nevertheless, look how John Lennox misinterprets what Harari says for his own ends.
There is a man who is God. Now, isn't it interesting, ladies and gentlemen, that when someone like Harari or Kearse says this is going to happen, people say, oh, that's fascinating. But when we claim that there is a man who is God, oh, they say you couldn't possibly believe that. That's the Bible, isn't it?
I know, John, it's hypocrisy is what it is. That's what it is. It's hypocrisy. It's like these stupid individuals who trust scientists when they're saying that they can make lightning, they can simulate lightning in their laboratories, and yet when I tell them that the lightning that's happening outside is because Thor's waving his mighty warhammer, they laugh at me as if I'm stupid. It's just a double standard on their part, isn't it? Or it could be that Harari is using metaphor, and what he's talking about by Homo Deus and humans as gods is so far adrift from what you're talking about that they are not comparable things. He is just using that language as metaphor. He is using it in a figurative sense and not in the literal sense in which you are willfully misunderstanding what he's saying. Now, one thing that I said to you, and I'll come back to this again later in the video, but I said that he doesn't seem to quite be able to decide whether consciousness and artificial general intelligence of superintelligence levels that we ought to be worried about is possible or not. Let me play you a couple of examples to show you exactly what I mean. Here's an example first off where he doubts that it is possible.
Why this stuff is really serious is that most of the thinkers, so far as I can ascertain who are working on it, are coming from a naturalistic, atheistic perspective. And you can see that if you believe that biological life happened without any divine intervention or input, then surely with human intelligence, we can create artificial life based on silicon. We can enhance by intelligent design the humans that we are at the moment. It's very logical from a materialistic point of view. It is not logical from the biblical point of view, which is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Okay, so I think John Lennox was being quite clear there. He was nailing his flag to the mast somewhat in saying that, yeah, from an atheistic perspective, you could understand how these things would be possible. But from a Christian perspective, it involves a little bit of God's input to do this kind of thing. And it isn't logical. It is not logical that we would be able to do these things from a Christian perspective. Then listen, now I'm going to play you a clip from much later in the video in the Q&A when he's asked pretty much the same question and he hedges his bets and gives almost entirely the opposite answer. Talk about wanting your cake and eat it. Listen to this.
John, do you envision AI to advance to a point to achieve cognitive consciousness and awareness? Would this cause problems with the doctrines of Christianity?
I don't think it would cause problems with the doctrines of Christianity. The short answer is, I just don't know.
So this is what I mean by cake and eat it. On the one hand, it's illogical for it to happen from the Christian perspective, but on the other hand, if it did happen, there'd be no logical disconnect between Christianity and the events that had just happened, i.e. these kind of things being created. On the one hand, he wants to suggest that no, because of my knowledge of Christianity, that leads me to doubt these things could happen. And on the other hand, when he's asked, can these things happen? He says, well, I just don't know. Perhaps they can, perhaps they can't. It seems as if he wants to just give different answers at different times. And so I watched the whole talk and I listened to the questions and I still didn't really know what he actually believes and what he actually doesn't. It's as if he wants to wear two hats, a scientific hat and a religious hat, and just wear a little bit of each hat just as and when he wishes and just swap between them as and when. I'm going to come back later in the video to this kind of disconnect between these two perspectives of AI, super intelligent, malevolent, in fact, AI is happening and not happening. But before I do, just some general comments on some other things he said in the video. So let me play you a couple of other clips of the video.
intelligence, and conscience. AI separates them, but God links them. Because in the Genesis account, we have a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Please, it's not the tree of knowledge. God didn't want to keep people from knowledge. There was loads of it in the garden. This kind of knowledge is a knowledge you don't want to have. And the analysis in Genesis is something that is way beyond any capacity or beginnings of a capacity of an AI system.
John, I got to stop you there because I'm afraid on this one, I'm in the same camp as these artificial intelligences that you're disparaging, because I cannot make head nor tail of this story either. Right, as far as I can understand this story, Adam and Eve are punished in the Garden of Eden for disobeying God before they had the knowledge, prior to them having the knowledge of good and evil, right and wrong. So before they even understood the concept that disobeying God was wrong, because they didn't have a conceptual understanding of wrong. How is that fair? How is that story anything other than nonsense? But it gets worse. There's more, John, as you would say, because not only are they punished, but all their descendants are punished. I'm being punished for something that I never did, for something that Adam and Eve did. But it's more than that. There's more, John. It gets worse, right, as you would say, because it's not just us that are punished, right? The snakes have been punished. Modern day snakes are still being delimbed because of a sin, not of a snake that was committed in the Garden of Eden, but of a sin committed by Satan disguised as a snake. How fucked up is that? How unfair is that, that a snake today has to slither along the ground and doesn't have any little legs so it can scuttle along because of something Satan did in the Garden of Eden, and he just happened to be disguised as a snake at the time. That story, John, this story, no way I can understand it. You know why? Because it's a load of absolute gibberish, right? You could have a super intelligence. We could create a super intelligent singularity, and it would still reach the same conclusion that this story is absolute fucking gibberish, because that is what this story is.
The first morality was vertical. It was determined by God. Now, this is a huge problem. If you reject God and you're building all kinds of systems that interact with human beings, what morality are you going to build into them? Where are you going to get it from? Because if there isn't a God, I would want to argue that morality ends up being essentially subjective. Now, that's another huge topic.
Okay, big boy, so where are you going to get it from then? Because all I can tell you is, if you give me 100 Christians, I will give you 100 different moral codes. So this is the problem, John. For all your talk that somehow God imbues morality with some kind of mind independence, some kind of objectivity, right? The problem is that Christians don't actually seem to have any access to it. So even if what you're saying is true, the point you have is absolutely moot, because even if the most devout Christian in the world is doing the programming, the morality that he or she has as an individual is as subjective as anybody else's. And I ought to add to this, because it's easy to look at these moral subjects in an all too simplistic manner and say, well, Christians would all agree that killing humans is something that a machine shouldn't do, so there's a bit of objectivity. This isn't what we're talking about. What we're talking about, is with regard to AGIs, artificial general intelligences, are moral dilemmas, just as we are with humans, but we're also very, very concerned about not being too literal with the moral codes that we would give such a machine. So in terms of moral dilemmas, it's not just a case of not killing people, it's a case where there's a conflict of interest, where each course of action that the machine performs will involve harm. It's too late in the day. So a family has stepped out on the road, and the AI that is controlling the car has to decide what course of action. Does it run the family over, or does it steer into that skip lorry and kill the occupants of the car, right? These are the kind of dilemmas that take place. How many people will die in this scenario? How many people will die in that scenario? What are the ages? What are the life expectancies? Who deserves to die the most? Where does the responsibility lie? Etc, etc, etc. No Christian can give you objective answers for these. And the other thing, as I say, is we need to be very, very careful. If you read in any detail about this, these are the concerns that machines will take things too literally. So if we say preserve human life and you get this kind of artificial intelligence, super intelligent singularity, it might say, right, that is my ultimate aim. I have to make sure that nobody dies. So even in circumstances where people would want to be made to die, maybe they will strip us of all autonomy, right? They'll stop us doing things because anything that we do could increase our chance of dying. So effectively it will keep us in a semi-conscious state, but just keep us as a living blob of material ad infinitum, right? Because this kind of super intelligence will have the kind of power to be very, very literal about any moral pronouncements we make in a way that we are not, and the way that we can measure them with our own personal concerns. So this is a much bigger and more complicated problem than John Lennox makes out with this smug suggestion of, well, if you're not a Christian, you won't have objective morals. And so, you know, how are you going to program the machine?
And we remember that one of Harari's propositions was that in this century, we are going to solve the problem of physical death. Are we? Because Genesis raises some very interesting points. It tells us that when humans disobeyed God, he removed from them a source of food that if they had had access to it would have kept them physically alive forever. That's what the text says. And you begin to wonder if the search for physical immortality all goes back to this story, that God excluded them from it. And you've probably read in classical mythology the search for the elixir of life. And now the modern version is the search for Homo Deus.
You know what? John Lennox ought to actually be ashamed for making this argument. If Ray Comfort made this argument, it would be a sorry, sad day for Ray Comfort, right? For a scientist to make this argument. There is nothing to be explained here. Right, the story of evolutionary history of the animal kingdom are animals clinging to life. We understand why. Natural selection explains why. Animals that cling to life, that take some sort of steps not to just die and to try and stay alive as long as is possible, succeed, whereas those that just go, oh, there's no food within reach, I tell you what, I'll just sit here and die, don't really succeed, don't get to pass on their genes. Almost any life form you look at, any animal life form you look at will cling to life and do almost anything that is necessary to stay alive if it is within their means to do so. And yet John's going, oh, this is a big mystery. This big mystery. Why would humans want to cling to life? Well, I've got an explanation. It's because God denied us this magical plant in the Garden of Eden. Maybe that's the reason why. Honestly, John? Honestly?
And now the modern version is the search for Homo Deus. So Harari projects into the future, and his idea is that we're going to upgrade humans into gods. The biblical answer to it is spectacular. Because there is a Homo Deus, a man who is God. But it's not man becoming God. It's God becoming man. And the heart of the Christian faith is that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, evidenced by his resurrection and his ascension. There is a Homo Deus. We don't have to wait for Harari or Kurzweil or anybody else to create a man who is God. There is a man who is God.
The interesting thing with this part is, to throw it in some context, you might listen to that and think, yeah, okay, so he's taking Harari's metaphor and sort of just using it to shoehorn in Jesus. And it's the equivalent of what he's saying is, I could say, well, we could have bionic legs and be like cheetahs. And he's saying, but you know there already are cheetahs. Like as if that's got anything to do with the price of fish. But what you need to understand is that what he's telling his audience effectively is that he sees this as an opportunity to go out and proselytize Christianity. That this is somehow going to convince us, right, that we might be having a discussion about transhumanism and talking about how in the future we can upgrade humans, right, and make humans more intelligent than they are, maybe through biological means or through some kind of implant or sort of human-machine interface. And what he's saying is you can sort of say, oh, well, that's almost like, so he's saying that's almost like humans becoming gods, and maybe they'll go, yeah, I suppose in a way, yeah, we'll be more powerful, you know, we might achieve some kind of immortality and that we won't need to physically die anymore unless we get run over by a bus or something. The aging process won't work in the same way. And he'll say, but Christianity says that there already is a man who was a god. And we're going to go, whoa, I'd never thought about it like that. So it must be true. Jesus must have existed. It's just such a huge non sequitur. I cannot believe you would sell Christianity to a single person by going down that route.
Now, one of the hopes of these people, you've probably heard it, is to upgrade ourselves and become more intelligent and all this kind of thing. But you see, there is already in existence a divine upgrade. And phase one is that any one of us, by trusting Christ as Lord and Savior who died for our sins, can become what we were not by nature, a child of God. That is a spectacular divine upgrade, isn't it?
I mean, it's a spectacular upgrade, John, and it's very, very impressive, but it just suffers from one fatal flaw, which is that it isn't actually true. And this is the problem. He's comparing this to the transhumanist claims, but what the transhumanists are saying is that potentially next week or the week after or the week after that, if you buy a lottery ticket, you could win the lottery. And what John Lennox is telling me is it's better than that. You actually already won the lottery last week. That would be better, John, if I had won the lottery last week. But unfortunately, the fly in the ointment is, the real pisser is that I didn't win the lottery last week. So although the transhumanist claims might not sound quite as great as yours, their advantage is at least there is at least the possibility that they could be true, that some of them could manifest as reality in the future, whereas we know because yours are linked to the past that they're not true. Okay, so at this point what I want to do is I want to move on to like the centerpiece of this response, which is to go back to what I said with these two very, very different arguments that he seemed to be making that didn't seem to sit very well alongside one another, and show you his central sort of peck at each one of them. What you need to know before you hear the first one, because like I say, this was a long lecture, it was an hour lecture in a 2-hour long presentation with question and answers and everything else, is that he made big mention of Max Tegmark. There's many other people he could have mentioned. Nick Bostrom, of course, didn't get a mention in this talk at all, but makes the same kind of arguments. And the kind of things that he was mentioning with Max Tegmark were these nightmare scenarios where a superintelligence is created and ends up as what is called a singularity, an intelligent singularity, whereby it exponentially grows in intelligence. We create an artificial general intelligence that is so intelligent that it can either create a new version of itself that's even more intelligent, or upgrade its own intelligence and create a version of itself that can then upgrade its own intelligence and iterate that process until it reaches a point that so far in advance of our own intelligence, it may as well be infinitely intelligent for all that it means to us, and would have entire dominion over our lives, and that could work out very, very badly depending upon the initial conditions that we had set for that artificial intelligence and how those conditions play out. So you're talking about an apocalyptic scenario, a negative scenario that impacts very, very badly on mankind. And of course, this drives in very much this idea of should we fear artificial intelligence. So that is the background upon which John Lennox makes the next few clips. John Lennox.
Now listen to the book of Revelation, written 20 centuries ago. Now this is imagery, but listen to it. It, that is the beast, deceives those who dwell on the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak, and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also, it causes all to be marked on their right hand, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark that is the name of the beast and the number of his name. Historically, people have tried to decode this gematria, putting numbers for letters, and work out who it is, and they've been spectacularly successful. Hitler has been in, Stalin's been in, virtually everybody. But that isn't the point. Because you see, if this human who behaves like a beast is revealed by the power of Satan and controls the whole world, you'll not have to play guessing games with numbers to know who it is. It'll be obvious. The 666 will simply be a check. Do we take it seriously? This is the way that Tegmark starts his book, talking about Prometheus. Here we have it in Scripture. Why shouldn't we take Scripture seriously? Now he says, you watch the trends in your society. This deification of emperors. Watch where it goes. This is where it's going to go to. And here are the AGI people telling us exactly the same thing on the basis of our speculations. I think we need to take these texts much more seriously than we've ever done in the past.
So I played you some chunks of that. I can't play the whole thing. It's just too much. But what he's saying here is that effectively Revelations is predicting all of this. Sure, people have said with Hitler and Stalin and other people, he makes this point that they're the manifestation of what is being talked about in Revelation. But he's saying, no, these are too trivial. You know, you shouldn't have to interpret things and use numerology. It will be so obvious. It will be inescapable. And this is a scenario that will be inescapable. Right? Nobody will question when this kind of catastrophic scenario takes place. So this is predicted in the Bible. Therefore, when these events come to pass, that will show that the Bible had predicted it all along. Fine. If that was his argument in this talk, then fine. But set it alongside this other argument, which appears to say exactly the opposite.
But there's good news, you know, because there's a divine upgrade phase 2. Phase 1 is becoming children of God through receiving Christ. Phase 2 is spectacular because it is a transformation. It's not bioengineering. This is what it is. Flesh and blood shall not inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. This mortal must put on immortality. That is a wonderful hope in the midst of all of this.
So not only is this quite contradictory, but it's also really, really confused. It goes back to what I said at the beginning, where he started talking about artificial general intelligence and confusing it with transhumanism as if they're the same thing, and he's doing the same thing now, because at one point he's talking about an artificial general intelligence gaining super intelligence and dominion over us, but then he segues seamlessly into actually, well, we're actually talking about transhumanism and biologically upgrading humans, and he's saying, but that might not be it. It might be this spiritual Jesus upgrade with the second coming of Jesus that we're actually talking about here. So what are these events he's talking about? What is this thing in the future that he's talking about? It's quite unclear, and the reason it's quite unclear is because he's conflating all these different ideas and then just picking. You can pick either one you like, and this is the problem that I had with his talk.
The ultimate affirmation of humanity version 1.0 is the fact that God became one. The Word became flesh. And the result of the incarnation, the death of and the resurrection of Jesus, that instead of speculative hope that one day we can upload the contents of our brains or we can be bioengineered to live forever, we have a sure and certain hope based on the true Homo Deus, that to as many as received him, to them gave he the right to become children of God. And we can lift up our heads in confidence, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. This mortal must put on immortality. That is the future of the Christian believer, ladies and gentlemen. And it is light years more credible and better than anything speculative AGI has to offer. Thank you very much indeed.
And I've got to ask, and I say that cognizant that you've not seen the full talk, you've only seen the few clips I would imagine that I've shown you. But did you find that more credible, or did you just find that horribly confusing? I've watched the whole thing and I just found it horribly confusing. It seemed to me as if John Lennox had two talks that he could give. He couldn't really decide which one to do, so he just gave both of them. And to make it really, really confusing, he just kind of interwove them both, like I say, in the same way that takes place in the books of the Torah. It's horribly confusing when it happened there, and it was horribly confusing here. In the first of those scenarios, AGI stroke transhumanism, because to John Lennox it's the same thing seemingly, takes over the world, and the biblical prophecy as prophesied by the book of John, which I didn't play you but it's in his talk, and Revelation comes true, comes to fruition, and it's a terrible scenario. And in the second, none of this happens, because actually this transhumanist advance is Jesus 2.0. It's a spiritual uplift, and again the Bible tells us that this is what is going to happen. In the first one, AGI of intelligence greater than humans is entirely possible and something that we can take on board, and in the second one, AGI of greater than human intelligence is absolutely illogical, and we know that because Christianity tells us that this is so. Either way, Christianity is validated. Heads, John Lennox wins. Tails, atheists lose. Okay, well, interested to know what you think about this. You've heard what I think about this. I would recommend you, I'll leave you a link to go and watch the original video. There is the preamble, there is the talk, which is what I dwelt on. Then there's a bit of bizarre Christian behind the scenes for about half an hour with a couple of people talking crap, basically, and then John Lennox comes out for some quite interesting Q&A. See what you think. Interested to know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and bye.